Good afternoon and welcome back to the Fix Sports Arena. Now, after our rousing start this morning, we're back for the second session here, looking at the contribution and potential of sport as an enabler of sustainable development. My name's Ollie Dudfield. I'm the Associate Director at the International Olympic Committee, and I'll be stewarding you through this afternoon's session here in person and online. Now, after we had a great example of the vibrancy and potential of the creative, cultural and sports industries this morning, we're getting more into the discussion and deep into the thematic areas. And currently there's 55% of the global population lives in cities and urban areas. That's going to grow to almost 70% by 2050, making urban areas absolutely essential to realise economic, social and environmental development. And sport, of course, can be an important vector in those areas, both through the potential of sport events, building and developing accessible and inclusive sport infrastructure, and stimulating the value chain in cities and urban areas. And that's what we're going to discuss this afternoon. And I'm thrilled to welcome a very high level and esteemed panel to really offer their insights into the potential of sport, urban development, and major events as a vector of sustainable development. I'm going to follow a tradition that started here at Fix 2025, not the amazing inclusion of a Fix Arena for the first time, but introducing the panelists one by one in the discussions, accounting for the tight schedule we have here at Fix 2025. And to start our discussions today, it gives us great pleasure as the Coalition of Sport for Sustainable Development, and I think more broadly those of us working in the sport sector and industry, to welcome Mr. Solomon Quaynor, who is the Vice President for Private Sector Infrastructure and Industrialisation at the Africa Development Bank. And Solomon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ollie.
Now, one thing that struck me in the last years is your institution's really been supporting some of the dialogue and discussion on this potential of sport infrastructure, of sport as a driver of industrial development, in particular through the Africa Investment Forum that's had this as a topic and a focus area on multiple occasions. So I wanted to start our discussion this afternoon to ask you, what do you see as the opportunities here? What are some of the models that as a bank you're drawing on, you think as a community we can draw on, and really your insights around this potential of sport infrastructure, sport events as a driver for economic and social development?
Okay, thank you very much, Ollie. I mean, let me start off really by saying that this is a space in Africa that we are all learning. We don't have the perfect answers, but we know what the benefits actually could be, and hence it's a space where we're all learning. And you know, just as background, you talked about the Africa Investment Forum. Let me share with people what the Africa Investment Forum is and why it's actually very important that we've been having conversations in this forum as to what the potential of sports is as a business, but also in terms of impact. So the Africa Investment Forum is really a transactional platform where 7 different partners, institutional partners, have come together to create a forum where we can actually showcase what we call the Baobab projects. The Baobab projects are really projects that none of us can do on our own, and we need to come together to be able to do those. And it's also a forum where we get the opportunity to expose global investors, regional investors to the transformational projects in Africa and we bring people around the table in what we call boardrooms. So we typically would have about 40 boardrooms where 40 different transformational projects are being showcased. But we also have plenaries where new ideas are really cultivated with different parties. So, for example, Masai Ujiri, who's the manager of the Toronto Raptors, if you actually go on the Africa Investment Forum website, you see about a 1-hour conversation in which he had with one of our moderators, talking about really sports as a business catalyst and also as a development catalyst. And this was actually a big eye-opener for a lot of us financiers around the table, okay? Because yes, we'd looked at sports, its importance to, youth development, etc., but we hadn't really looked at it, as an institution from really a business perspective. But we always knew that there was potential from an impact perspective. So this was, the beginning, should I say, of the education. And then subsequent to that, we've actually had boardrooms where, sports projects were actually discussed. The Africa Investment Forum has, AFDB as the key sponsor, but in there we also have AfriExim, we also have Trade and Development Bank, we have the European Investment Bank, we have Africa 50, we have the Africa Finance Corporation. So these are the founding members that I'm talking about. We have also the Islamic Development Bank. But we also use this to convene, equity investors from the private equity side. We bring in also, export credit agencies, etc. But very importantly, we also bring in the government in addition to private sector, because in a lot of cases, you still need government to help unlock the opportunities from a regulatory, policy, and institutional perspective. So that's, from the Africa Investment Forum. But for us as well, why are we interested in sports really as a business? It's not really the focus on profitability, but it's really the impact on youth development, okay? The impact on youth development, has actually been so convincing that for us, the demographic that we have, the asset that we have in Africa today is a youthful demographic. However, if we don't harness that youthful demographic, and we're already seeing the evidence from migration challenges across the Mediterranean, etc., if we don't actually create those opportunities within Africa to harness this youth population, it may not be a demographic dividend, it will be something that, we're all concerned about. So I think, that impact perspective also, pushes us to say, let's learn more. Let's see how we can, really dimension this opportunity and see how, we can actually marry investments and impact, okay? So today, we're still learning. We're taking a look at a film fund, okay? So it's the broader creative industry space. We're also looking to, I've spent a lot of time in Rwanda. As a lot of you would know, President Kagame is a big supporter of sports as a business. So we've taken a look at the arena economics. We've looked at the infrastructure parts because we are primarily infrastructure financiers. We've looked at the content part, the merchandising part. And definitely there's a lot of potential, especially because it's not just single project opportunities. It's really about an ecosystem, for example, around arenas. And what is most compelling is for every dollar you put into sports, you can generate $124 of economic spillover, activity. So look, these are, the reasons why we're motivated to look at it, very closely. We're learning, but we're also learning by doing, because we don't have time to get it all perfect. And ultimately, we're actually commissioning, a major, what we call economic and sector work. It's really almost a major study, but not an academic study. A study keeping in mind what our comparative advantages are, and how we can then support sports as a business.
I think it really struck me there when you spoke about the $1 of investment in sport can generate up to $124 in economic spillover, and you went from there to the learning journey that you're on as a bank, and I think we've heard a lot over the last 2 days around the opportunities, particularly in the African continent, to really drive this opportunity, this growth opportunity from sport events, as the Olympic movement, as we look forward to Dakar 2026, certainly on that similar learning journey around really maximising the potential of events, understanding the important interplay of infrastructure investment and the capacity of cities, of countries to host these events. With that, what would you say as the community of FIX, as the Sport Coalition, and then specifically as the bank should be the next steps and really the advice and guidance from your side to realise this potential of events, of infrastructure and of sport to help drive the social and economic development that you touched on?
So I think we have to look at it from an ecosystem perspective, and each one of us has to bring in the areas of expertise. But the public development banks, especially the national development banks, have a big role to play. You know, in this sense, if I use the Rwanda example, if a country prioritizes, for example, the building of stadiums or arenas, then through our public sector window, we can actually support the financing of those projects. I think the arena economics are such that you can't necessarily do it purely on a private sector basis to get your returns within, let's say, the 5 to 7 years that private equity is looking for. It's really a longer return, financial return period, but definitely, you know, a very good economic return. Because, you know, for governments, they're not looking at just the financial return of the asset, but they're looking at that economic linkage, sort of the 1 to 124 ratio that I spoke about. Then for some of us, you know, we can look at it even beyond infrastructure. I mean, this, as you had mentioned in your earlier intervention, is about urban development, cities development. And we all know that with the urban migration, our cities are really under pressure to deliver the right level of infrastructure services. So we already are focused really on cities development. So when we begin to couple, you know, various areas in which we have a comparative advantage, I think we can together, you know, the MDBs, the PDBs, private sector, okay, I'm not going to talk about philanthropic capital here, but there could be even a role for philanthropic capital, because ultimately the development or impact returns are so huge, and so we've got to find a way to work together, you know, and then probably identify a few countries. I mean, look, for example, the African Cup of Nations ends up really with stadiums that have almost no usefulness, you know, afterwards. Or, you know, the African Games, you know, would end up with arenas. So there are already reasons why some countries would really spend, so maybe we can even come afterwards to really support the retention of those assets, you know, the monetizing of those assets to really anchor sports as a business. So I think, you know, we have to be more innovative. The potential speaks to itself, and maybe we end up looking at things in bite sizes. You know, we don't necessarily finance the Anchor Arena, but then, you know, the hotels next door, you know, the training facilities. You know, we find ways essentially to look at this as a public-private partnership that works.
Fantastic. You painted a very vivid picture with the Africa Investment Forum around boardrooms and bringing these different stakeholders together in the boardroom there at the forum. But I think you extended out there to government, to multilateral and public development banks, private sector, all being part of this journey. We had an experience of that with Paris 2024 in terms of these range of actors coming together. And if I can, I might just give a snapshot of what that boardroom, as you called it in the Africa Investment Forum context, coming together can mean and look like in terms of both economic and social development. If we could play the first video, please.
We believe the games can change society, but that they must also evolve with society. So that there is no going back. We worked together to do things differently, so we can prove that there are other ways. Building less, building better. Choosing the alternative solutions, even if it wasn't the easiest way. And we did it all, not only for the games, but also for a long-term legacy, to inspire an entire generation to get moving, to support the ones who will survive us, to empower all of those who believe we can change the world through sport. Faster, higher, stronger, together.
I'm going to turn the conversation over now to Mr. So Sato, who's now a lecturer and academic at Rutsuzu Kaiser University, also involved with Asatoma, who are actors in the sport for development field, but you were with the Japan Sports Council and part of the broader coalition of organisations involved with Tokyo 2020. We just saw a snapshot of Paris 2024, but of course it was 3 years before that, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, that Tokyo brought the world together and was able to generate, I think, a lasting legacy from Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. Can you give us a snapshot of that legacy and that impact?
Thank you, Ori. My name is Sho Sato. I was working at the Japan Sports Council and involved in the legacy project of the game. So I'd like to highlight 3 issues for the ongoing legacy issues of the games. One is urban development, and second one is a local and community development, and third one is international development. The first one, in terms of urban development, Tokyo Games has become to redevelop the sports infrastructure. The national stadium, of course, for example, became a symbol of accessibility and sustainability with the inclusive and the environment consideration. The stadium currently is used not just for the high-performance sport, but for more inclusive and combine both able athletes and para-athletes together. So that has become the catalyst for the further development of the sport infrastructure currently being planned. In addition to the sports infrastructure, there are lots of accomplishments in urban development. Public transportation promoted its accessibility. Bicycle road expansion promoted physical activity for citizens. The athlete village has become a residential area last year as a pilot of so-called hydrogen society, strengthening decarbonization. So those are the milestones to change the people's mindset to be more inclusive in Tokyo. Second point is a local or community development. It is crucial, important because of the domestic problem in Japan due to the aging society and the decrease in the population. So the government led the initiative called Host Town at the time, and it was mainly implemented between the countries' delegation and the local cities' interaction opportunities. So it was mainly implemented as a pre-games camp for each national teams, including the cultural exchange with different generations. Interestingly enough, it has been continuing even after the games by the ownership of each city, which is a legacy localization. Furthermore, research evidence accumulated for high-performance sports is currently being used for the grassroots level, especially for the elderly people's sports participation. Finally, international development. The sport for development and peace sector has been evolved as a preparation stage of Tokyo Games. So governmental organizations, non-state actors have been engaged in the sport for development activities by implementing the projects. It is mainly by the JICA at the main PDB in Japan. And this year, Tokyo is going to have Tokyo International Conference for African Development, we call it TICAT. So that will be, sport is gradually being recognized as an important thematic area of the development. So that is also the legacy of and social impact of the Tokyo's Games. Thank you, Ori. That is.
Thank you. So, Christina Malloy, the Chief Impact and Membership Officer at the International Paralympic Committee. I'd like to bring you in now, but I was just struck, Solomon, you spoke about ecosystem, and so you really spoke there, I think, from a local to a national to an international element of how that games can be a vector for development across that ecosystem. But let's come back to last summer, for those of us in the northern hemisphere, with Paris 2024. And Christina, the Paralympic Games were particularly impactful in advancing public policy and societal outcomes on accessibility and inclusion. Drawing on the boardroom analogy and the different actors in that boardroom, can you give us a picture of, from your perspective, how Paris 2024 was a vector for those accessibility and inclusion outcomes, and who were the actors that were critical in achieving that legacy from the Games?
That's great. Excuse me. Thanks, Ollie. To give a little bit of context to start, the International Paralympic Committee considers itself a sport organization, but one that's grounded within a social movement. And the social movement being to advance the rights and opportunities of people with disabilities. And unfortunately, across just about every metric, people with disabilities perform worse than those without. And in particular, when we're talking about physical activity, access to education, so these end up being real focal points for us in terms of what we're trying to drive with that social movement for disability inclusion. And at the IPC, we believe that change starts with sport. That's our mantra. And I'm guessing for those of us here today that we're all pretty bought into that concept. And for us, what that means is that we need to use sport, and for us, the tool of parasport, to change attitudes and stigma towards disability, to advance greater mobility, and to create opportunities both for social and economic inclusion for people with a disability. And ultimately, Paris is one of the best examples of that, or illustrations of how a major event like the Paralympic Games can create a massive transformation for an entire population of people with disabilities. And so in the case of Paris, I really like the way the mayor of Paris described hosting of the Paralympic Games. She said that it brought on an accessibility revolution, not just within the city, but around the country. And what that led to was significant investment, more than we've ever seen before, specifically in disability inclusion. So in that case, the national government invested $1.5 billion in various social and accessibility initiatives specific to disability inclusion. The city of Paris invested $125 million, similarly in accessibility. And while, yes, some of it had to do with sport, we found that leading into the games, only 1.4% of all sports clubs in France could welcome people with a disability. And so there was a commitment made to increase to 3,000 clubs across the country that were accessible and inclusive. But I think what's even more interesting is that it pushed beyond the bounds of sport and created accessible municipal facilities, accessible schools. Access to voting became more accessible. And this is all coming out of the hosting of one Paralympic Games. It also drove some really significant policy changes, one of which was the reduction in taxes for assistive devices like wheelchairs that came down from 20% to 5%. Another policy example within Paris was that a commitment was made that no family would have to travel more than 15 minutes to get their kids to an accessible school. And there was a focus on urban development that brought a lot of partners together so that accessible communities were created within each neighborhood within Paris. And so it also shows that you can adapt even a very historic and ancient city to become more accessible. And it doesn't happen overnight, but it can happen. And now what we're seeing looking ahead to Milano Cortina is this additional focus on tourism. So museums being made more accessible, hotels. The corporate world is getting more engaged in the fact that you can engage with a much bigger market share of people with disabilities. The World Economic Forum estimates that the spending power of people with the disabilities and their families is about 13 trillion US dollars. So there's real potential there. And so I think my final message on that is that when Paris and France were kind of seized with the fact that they were going to have thousands of people, athletes, and other participants with a disability descending on them for the Paralympic Games, it actually turned their attention to their own population of people with a disability, and they leveraged that opportunity to create these massive advancements that are creating a generational change of inclusion for people with a disability in France.
Descending on Paris and bringing some of that 13 trillion of spending power to the economy. What I really picked up was, and from So yourself as well, you spoke about the impact extending from global major events into local communities. And in a moment, I'm going to bring in Herman Pinner from UN Habitat, and last but not least, host Kari Juice from Development Bank of Southern Africa. But before we go very local and looking at that impact of infrastructure in local communities, so can I come back to you quickly, because we're at a gathering here of multilateral development banks, public development banks. So imagine there's an interest in the role that they played in the legacy of Tokyo, and then the role played in Paris and beyond to Milano Cortina. Can you give us a snapshot? You spoke before about Japan International Cooperation Agency. What was the role of the public development banks, the public financing, development financing institutions in Tokyo's legacy?
Thank you, Ori. Yes, of course, PDB has a quite important role to create the legacy of Tokyo 2020 Games. I'd like to pick up two examples of the public development banks in Japan. One is JICA, which is Human Development Perspective. They are the co-chair of the Coalition for Sustainable Development through Sport. And their perspective is more a human-centered approach. So they have contributed mainly through the JICA volunteers, PE teachers, and sports coaches. It accumulates around 5,000 volunteers across the world historically. And in Tokyo Games, more than 20 athletes who have been trained by JICA volunteer participated as an athlete. So that is a legacy. And also, ex-JICA volunteers in Japan joined as a staff to support countries for the countries they have been dispatched to, which created strong bonds, ties between the countries bilaterally. So in terms of JICA, as PDBs, there are lots of development aid schemes, including technical assistance, capacity building, and infrastructure by grants. So how to combine the existing human resources and various schemes as a development aid organization is quite important to maximize the impact of the social impact of the legacy of major sport events. That is one point. And another thing is that PDB is called Development Bank of Japan. We call DBJ. They've implemented several researches in terms of sports industry, economic growth. So clarifying the sports GDP, referring the measurement framework created by the European Commission, and quantifying the social value of the sports stadium arena, which created robust evidence how the sports sector could be proceeded through the major sport event. However, unfortunately, Tokyo Games faced the pandemic, so we couldn't face a big economic impact through the games, but we accumulated a lot of research evidences economically. So that is the legacy. Lastly, the role to realize so-called impact economy in Japan in sports sector is quite important. So PDB has a role to unlock the potential financial resources from different sectors. So in that sense, impact investment is quite important in Japan now, although it is a new paradigm we received. So as I introduced, the human development perspective and the economic research perspective is, in my opinion, it is very important to accelerate the future major sport events legacy and as a public development bank's role.
Fantastic. Thank you. So you spoke about impact investment as one potential instrument around a range of strategic policy approaches. I want to quickly go to Christina, and then we're going to get hyper-local and place-based. Same question to an extent to you, but I really wanted to focus on the infrastructure question. The IPC, the International Paralympic Committee, has been a leader in advocating for inclusive and accessible sport infrastructure. So what role do you see public development banks being able to play in the future in helping to drive this agenda and the economic and social impact that can come from accessible infrastructure?
Yeah, thanks, Ollie. And to give some statistics to start, to give a bit of a sense of why this is important and what we're talking about, the estimation, which is a conservative estimate, is that there's between 15 and 16% of the global population that have a disability, but that these numbers are actually much higher in development communities and a lot of the target locations for PDBs. So that's the first part that makes it an important consideration. The next is that, or maybe the way I'd position it is by dispelling first a few myths. The first is that people are not the problem, the barriers are the issue. So people with a disability are not the issue, it's actually the barriers that have been created that they're faced with. So an inaccessible venue or inaccessible infrastructure is what's disabling rather than the condition on the individual themselves. So that's the first myth to dispel. The second myth is that this is not someone else's problem to solve. And it's interesting that as we talk about sustainability, as we talk about development, and as we talk about inclusion, we have to talk about disability as a component of that. And unfortunately, especially over the last few days, that hasn't really been coming up as part of the general discourse. And we won't achieve the SDGs without specific consideration for disability inclusion, and it also won't happen on its own or organically without our own intervention. And then maybe the last myth before I'll get into a bit more of a call to action is that this is not about charity. There's a real potential and economic opportunity in terms of designing things accessible. It's also far more cost-effective to design something accessible and inclusive from the start than to try and retrofit it at a later date. And that all it takes is some innovation in terms of design and thoughts to shift the paradigm in terms of it really not being that difficult to design with accessibility in mind. And at some point in time, or even today, we've all benefited from accessible design, and we will benefit from it. So it also isn't about a specific segment of the population, but about creating greater usability for everyone in terms of these various infrastructure projects. And then maybe shifting into I have two specific calls to action. I'm going to keep it simple to two. The first is, and specifically targeted to PDBs and infrastructure investments, is that accessibility has to be a condition of funding. This is critically important because, like I said, it won't just naturally happen on its own, and people tend to defer back to the way it's always been done or the way something has been designed is how it's designed again. And unfortunately, that's just continuing right now to perpetuate greater barriers with the money that's being invested. But what we can do and what the IPC have is a guide to make it really easy. So if in the jurisdiction that the project is happening doesn't really have specific regulations or stringent regulations for accessibility, The IPC Accessibility Guide, which is available online, can answer the question of how do I design something in an accessible way? What should the counter height be? How should the bathroom be designed? All of that, all of those questions are answered, and it's a resource that we'll include in the FIX website and list of tools as well. So that's something that's available to everyone right now to refer to and to make a condition of funding. And then the second call to action is related to representation. If people with a disability are not present, especially in the local context, at the design and implementation phases, in particular with programming and inclusive programming, then we won't achieve disability inclusion, because we need to be part of that decision-making process in order to drive for greater both economic and social opportunities and returns from these projects.
A strong message: representation in decision-making, conditionality on funding. There's tools available from the IPC, and I think what I took away, this is because it delivers social economic impact as well as being a human rights and justice issue, and it's much more expensive to retrofit, much more expensive. We're at the halfway point, half time if you like, at this session, and I realised I've been a little bit say neglectful in my role as the moderator, and that we are at the halfway point, and I haven't yet called for a round of applause for the insights from our first three panellists. So can you join me in thanking them? We won't try and compete with the cheering from the table tennis tournament, but I think it was a good round of applause nevertheless. I said and promised for the second half, we're going to look at that catalytic effect of the major events, the major infrastructure, but look at that and transition to local infrastructure, place-based approaches. Let's have a little snapshot to set the context for the second half of our discussion.
In today's rapidly growing cities, sport is a low-cost, high-impact tool for sustainable urban development. By 2050, 70% of the global population will call cities and urban areas home. This is why the IOC and UN Habitat are working with cities to weave sport into urban planning to help more people access the benefits of playing sport and staying active. We are demonstrating how sport for all in cities and hosting mega sporting events can empower communities and drive social, economic, and environmental progress.
With effective policies, programs, and infrastructure development. These benefits can be experienced by a diverse range of people across a diverse range of cities and communities as well.
Mega events are a fantastic platform to contribute to SDGs, but we also provide solutions for cities to encourage them to develop active design, which is clearly working, and encourage people in a spontaneous way to move more and to be more active every day.
It's not going to happen without innovative financing, without building local capacities, and ensuring we leave no city, no place, no community behind.
To make this vision a reality, now is the time to act.
Herman, we saw a theme here in this video that actually has run through the first half of our discussion, that the impact of investment in sport infrastructure, the impact of stimulating the sport value chain and ecosystem can go down to local community development, local community level. You drive a lot of UN Habitat's work, human settlement work, some of the innovation work, some of the SDG localization work. I'll be interested in your insight and assessments coming from both your role at UN Habitat, but also your previous role in the Johannesburg government and local government in the Johannesburg area of the social economic impacts that sport can make, sport infrastructure can make at a local level.
Thank you very much. I think that from UN Habitat's perspective, our real objective is to implement the Sustainable Development Goals at a local level and to create sustainable, resilient and livable cities at the end of the day. How do we do that? Cities have got major challenges, especially in the developing world. And we've seen the statistics from the World Health Organization that 19% of adolescents have got enough daily activity to be able to live a healthy lifestyle. That's a shocking number. And why is it like that? And how can we change that? So the objective is really that if one can promote sport, and if one can use sport as a catalyst to activate areas, then that's a good way to lead urban development processes. And we've seen enough evidence that if sport is planned in a holistic way and as part of a broader development process and well integrated, and that all of these issues about accessibility and inclusiveness for all are taken into consideration, that it could lead to a healthy city that is really livable. I think part of the main issue is that sport needs to become part of the everyday planning discourse within cities. It's not something that's added on at the end. It needs to be in the same paradigm as what they plan for schools, for open space, for roads, electricity, all of those things, and sport facilities need to be in there. And I want to distinguish between two levels. The one is where there's big sport events that's happening that could act as a major catalyst and push a lot of infrastructure investment into cities. But I also want to deal as a second layer as what I would call the everyday activities that are happening in cities that are more the legacy projects that's going on in that respect. And as has been indicated, I've been very involved in the city of Johannesburg for the strategic planning and capital investment planning prior to the 2010 World Soccer and even after that. And the whole agenda at that stage was a transformation agenda. And in that sense, sport was used very effectively to create a transformative environment and legacy projects that go with that. The issue with large projects is that it starts to create the kind of urgency to deal with issues that you've known about for quite a long time, but has never been able or never had the focus and energy to actually deal with. And in that sense, it acts as a major catalyst to not only provide the sporting facilities, but to provide all the ancillary facilities that go with that. And I'm thinking about things like public transportation, the fan spaces that could later be transformed into public spaces, the kind of electricity and communication networks that are required for those events are things that later on develop major economic development within cities. The key issue is that it needs to form part of a broader development agenda that are human-centered and look at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals up front. But it also needs to transcend to the neighborhood level. It needs to get down to a community level. And so part of that exercise is also to provide sporting facilities within neighborhoods, to make sure that there's accessibility there. But it's also the non-sporting things that are not specifically formal sport, but it's informal. It's the cycle lanes that go in. It's the walking spaces that are there. Public space is one of the most important areas that's not only a holder of sporting facilities, formal and informal, but it also provides connections for pedestrians to go to and for. And I want to delve a little bit into a product that we created called My Neighborhood. And you can look at that framework and tools on the internet. But it basically has got 5 main components that draws in what does it mean to implement the Sustainable Development Goals on the ground. And it looked at compact cities, connected cities, inclusive cities, vibrant cities, and resilient cities. Those are the 5 concepts. And you can think about how do we incorporate sport in each and every one of those. Each and every one of those has got a sporting component, and where sport isn't just something that gets added on, it's something that could lead that principle and help with the actual implementation. And I want to concentrate a little bit on the vibrancy aspect with a example or two. Vibrancy within areas really relate to the amount of activities that are within a particular space. And you look at usually areas with a high level of mixed users, with good open public spaces, and the high quality of public environment are usually more vibrant spaces, provided that there's activity. And sport is one of the most fantastic things to use to create activity. And I use the example of, in my neighborhood, there's this cycle route that goes up and down to one of the reserves. And someone started a coffee shop on the road next to it. And then cyclists, when they come back, would stop there and start to drink. And so there's an activity point. Then I know about people that change their running routes to also do the same thing and stop there. And then suddenly people say, well, here's something happening. Why don't we go and have a coffee there? They're not sport people, but they use that. And suddenly that space becomes an activity space and a landmark within that neighborhood. And it inspires other people to also take up a bicycle or just go for a walk because it looks nice and it creates a social environment. There's a sport park in Jakarta. Now, Jakarta is a very polluted city, right? A huge pollution problem, but a large sport park, multiple sports that are happening around that. Every Saturday, all the roads in that area gets closed for the Saturday morning. There's huge activities, roller skaters, people on bicycles, people running, street sports that are being played all around that park that are happening there. Now there's food trucks. It becomes such a festive area, and that's where I think that sport comes in to create a livable city. And during those mornings, you can actually breathe, right? The air is breathable, it's clean, you can actually go. So I think in terms of quality environment, and that's when I think if we implement the Sustainable Development Goals, that's what it should look like. And I think sport is a fantastic catalyst to do that. And I thank you very much for the work that are being done through the committees that exist to enable that as a leading intervention that we can do within cities.
Fantastic. And you really made an important point about getting this down to the neighbourhood level, getting it down to the community level. And we're starting to come to the final quarter, and it's very poignant now that we bring in Carrie. And I'm going to break protocol a little bit, if people will join me in that. And I want to speak about a very concrete example of a public development bank enabling that impact at a local level, at a place-based level with the D-Labs. And we saw some fantastic insights to that if you've come through the arena. But before that, can you join me? I think we should also acknowledge and thank the role of Development Bank of Southern Africa in the leadership alongside the Fixed Coalition, alongside AFD, alongside AIB, in enabling the sports arena to happen. And Carrie in particular for your leadership and drive on this. So if you could join me on that.
Thank you.
But I won't stop there. I'm now going to ask you, can you give us some insight into the D-Labs?
Yeah.
And why is it that a public development bank is investing in an initiative like the D-Labs?
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, everyone. So, looking from a development bank perspective, development is at the heart of who we are. So about 5 years ago, we looked at looked at our roles. Where should we be playing? How else do we get involved on the ground to create access? So I think that's a theme I'm taking again from today, is that reminder of access. So what do we mean by access? Access to a space in common, that's what we looked at, in communities, in underserved communities, economic participation and employment pathways, especially for women and youth. So when we were looking at our role, one thing that we found is typically the development banks don't get involved in the implementation on the ground. So we thought, well, okay, structuring-wise, how do we do this? So we looked at creating a platform for participation where partners come together, and how we structured it is we partnered directly with civil society. So we partnered in the examples that you're seeing in the arena today with Amanda Social Enterprises and our labs. They became our implementing partners. And I think the key distinction I want to highlight is the relationship difference, because it wasn't a donor relationship that we were looking to structure, first of all. And I think that's quite key if we look at the development results that are coming back. So we look to create a partnership a partnership that obviously as an innovation we were learning along the way. So to create these spaces in communities there was a requirement for infrastructure, and then there was a requirement to activate the infrastructure, which is another common challenge we saw, is often there's huge investment into infrastructure, but they either close down after a period of time, or they haven't taken the community into account, which we've heard of on the panel. So we provided an investment, a seed investment into the infrastructure for the communities. But then our implementing partners actually activate that and bring it to life. What we do then is we structure according to development impact results across 5 core themes with the ultimate goal of economic participation and fostering resilience. And for us, that's why sport and the broader creative economy is critical. We see now, and the partners can attest to it, is the anchor within the communities is that access to the sport and the creative economy. So what we've noticed is by creating this space is the youth actually come into the communities, mostly for the sport, for the recreation, and then they get plugged in to the co-working space, or what our one partner calls the youth cafe, where they start to understand about learning and growing themselves. Or different economic opportunities. So then we started to look at what about financial sustainability of these precincts, because our funding obviously from an operational perspective, which is a unique component for a PDB as well, for a development finance institution, especially focusing on infrastructure, is we looked at the OPEX from a capacity building perspective. And we said, how do we free up the people who are doing the development on the ground to really focus on the core, which is the development. So they are the ones who have the expertise in their fields. So you would also notice from a platform perspective is, while sport is the core and the heart, is each of our precincts have a health component, a digital component, looking at the different economies that are activated. And the innovative component is also, just linking it back to that financial sustainability, is we set a goal that after 5 years, each precinct would need to wash its own face, so to speak. They needed to be financially viable. So our role would be come in, partner directly with the NPO, which typically isn't the case. We walk a journey together. I think they can attest. Some of them are here. It hasn't been easy. We've had a lot of learnings. We still continue to learn, but the impact, the catalytic effect of this approach of partnerships, us coming into de-risk, has also then crowded in other partnerships. So I think that the other key learning that we set about is there's a huge distinction between what the spaces are like in cities and in the rural areas. And also how we activate them is really different. Yeah.
Kerry, made me think of something Solomon said at the start around the assessment, the analysis, the learning journey around the opportunities that are presented in this broader sort of vertical of sport, whether events, local level. I know there's been a lot of learning from other development banks from the DLAB model. Christina, you spoke about the guidelines from the IPC. A lot of this comes together through the coalition of development banks for sport for sustainable development. Kerry, I might stay with you. Can you give us a feel for what DBSA has got from the coalition and that opportunity for other public development banks who have an interest in this learning journey around stimulating and growing social and economic impact through sport?
100%. I think we've had a huge learning, also just looking at the different opportunities with our sister DFIs and PDBs, where they are focusing on. So some have been focusing on specific the economic opportunities, or just sport for place-based programs, or sport for development. So the key learning is the platform and the coming together. So the conversations we've had as a result of being part of the coalition is, where are we each leading in, And instead of reinventing the wheel, how do we do it together? How do we come together to pool the resources? Financial learning across the board. So I think that's really one of the key things. I think we're really excited to say we already partner with 2 or 3 of our coalition partners in the DFI space, and also from a private sector perspective, there's NPOs, but then also the private sector space who are coming together. So I think moving forward, the coalition, the sport coalition, is a critical driver for partnerships and driving development impact, which is another key learning, is how do we measure the change, because that definitely crowds in other partnerships.
Fantastic. I'm actually going to go back to Solomon to close us off and ask him for his takeaways for us as a real leader in the development financing space. So we'll finish where we started. But Herman, just before that, one of the things that, or one of the issues that Solomon spoke about was the importance of government, national, subnational, and prioritising this space. Given you work extensively with local government, just in a few words, are you seeing appetite and an understanding and a growing desire from subnational governments to mobilise financing and investment, public-private, for this space? And what can be done to further raise that awareness?
Yes, I think there's definitely a growing appetite to do that. And it's not just the appetite, it's a necessity. No city has enough money to cover all the bases. And especially if you have ambitions to really develop the city in a particular way and create a particular identity, those are issues that there's never enough money to go around to cover the sort of have-to-do maintenance things, and then to do something new and exciting. And for that, you need this partnership. And I think especially when it comes to sporting events, it's impossible for cities, even with national government support, to do it on their own. And the importance of creating that partnership between PDBs, cities, and community is such an important triangle that strengthens everything. It builds confidence, and it also broadens the capital budget base for cities, because it's concessionally loans that are done that basically provide additional capital capacity within cities. And I think that, as I've mentioned before, this catalyst then allows you to focus resources in a particular way. Yep. In 2010, the build-up to that, since 2007, the capital budget of Joburg was around between 4 and 5 billion rand per annum. It moved up gradually to 7 to 8, and we ended up in 2029 with an 11 billion rand budget for capital expenditure. And it's not just to get the event there, but it's also after that. And that gave rise the kind of public transportation that went in, the public facilities that went in. There were more than 100 soccer fields that were built across the city in neighborhoods, parks that got rolled out. That gave rise to the whole notion of the Corridors of Freedom. That was a program that ran for many years and almost a decade after that, with huge funding sources behind that, and crowding in immense private sector investment. And I think those are the things that gives the private sector security and de-risk their investments. And once they come in, you really are cooking on gas, and you really see the transformation happening.
I think that de-risking issue is a really key one. Solomon, we started with the Africa Investment Forum. We started a discussion this afternoon with some of the insights and outcomes that came from the Africa Investment Forum. Let's finish now at FIX 2025 and give you the final word on some insights and outcomes that have come from this discussion at FIX 2025.
So it's been a very enriching discussion, and for me, listening to my partner panelists, I began to see things through multiple lenses, and I think this is very important for us as public development banks, as multilateral development banks. And I think the core word, I mean, we've been talking about sports as a business. Oli, I cheated a little bit. I forgot to tell you that I've seen it on the other side. I used to be an investment banker in New York, covering media and entertainment companies, which included sports. So I've seen it on the other side.
So you left that to the end
Yes.
to tell us.
Yes. So I think what's interesting is how do we leapfrog in our local context? And I think the key thing is not sports as a business, but sports as a catalyst. You know, I mean, as I listen to all of you, it's really about sports as a catalyst. And for those of us who are financiers, think about it from a shopping mall perspective. You know, the viability of a shopping mall is anchored around the anchor tenants. So sports can be the anchor tenant of an arena, but there are going to be other ways in which one can monetize, you know, that asset, you know, so the asset management. And just so that it doesn't sound like I'm speaking Greek, you know, in the African context, this arena could be used for some major church and religious services. It could also be used for some weddings. It could also be used, so it's got a multi-platform, but it's driven by sports. Now, the reason I say catalyst, one of the things that we haven't even talked about from a government's perspective is if sports permeates society greater, then the healthcare bill begins to drop over time. It's not immediate, but it's a long-term impact. So when, I think for me, it's really sports as a catalyst. And when I say that it's got the spillover benefits, it's really what we've heard from all the panelists. There are different benefits. And so this is something that should be part of the development agenda. And we have to figure out how to crack this in the context, at least for me, Africa, in the shortest period of time.
Sport as a catalyst, sport as an anchor tenant, whether in stadia or in local communities. Can you join me in thanking our panelists, Solomon, So, Christina, Herman, and Carrie? Thank you for joining us for this discussion. Thank you to those who are driving the coalition of public development banks for sport for sustainable development. And I look forward to seeing you back here in 15 minutes to discuss innovative financing tools, including the Global Sport Impact Fund. Thank you.